It's likely that everybody who comes from a modern country is familiar with what a chainsaw is. It's a fairly common tool. Some 3 million are sold each year in the United States, and according to the marketing firm Ariston, the global chainsaw market will reach around $4.5 billion by 2024. But when you think of the history of the invention of the chainsaw, you probably imagine that its only connection to something like, say, medicine would be the around 28,000 people a year in the United States who are injured by them. But on that count, you would be wrong. The shocking history of the mechanically driven cutting device where teeth are affixed to a chain is history that deserves to be remembered. Saws for cutting wood have existed for millennia, with the earliest made of flint, obsidian, or even shark teeth. Copper saws in Egypt have been dated to the First Dynasty some 5,000 years ago. The earliest known sawmill comes from ancient Rome and was for sawing stone rather than wood. According to Chinese legend, the saw was invented by Lu Ban, who cut his hand on a spiny leaf and realized that the same concept could be used to make tools for cutting trees. The Greeks attributed the invention of the saw to Talos, nephew of Daedalus. Archaeologically, it's clear that the saw existed in prehistory, and like the axe, chisel, and adze, were clearly established more than 4,000 years ago. Working towards the modern chainsaw, inventors sought ways to make cutting more efficient and quick. Water-powered sawmills for cutting lumber were in use from at least the 6th century, with written accounts dating even earlier. Whip saws or pit saws were in use even earlier and utilized the power of 2 workers, one standing above the log while the other stood below in either a saw pit or under a sturdy platform. The sawyers could then cut through raw logs and turn it into lumber. Smaller saws and instruments were used to do more detailed work, and so the saw quickly made its way into a very different kind of cutting: surgery. Saws could be used as effective means for cutting bones, especially in amputations, but perhaps surprisingly, the earliest chainsaws were actually invented not to assist with the cutting of wood, but for a more basic problem: childbirth. Compared to most animals, humans have a particularly difficult time with giving birth. This is largely attributed to what is called the obstetrical dilemma, or the problem that the human babies have relatively large heads but small birth canals. Human infants also have to manage a series of twists and turns during birth. Humans are the only creatures on Earth who often require assistance from other humans to successfully and safely give birth. In antiquity, giving birth was a particularly dangerous act, and death during childbirth was common enough that it significantly impacted average lifespans. Using knives, humans around the world were aware of the procedure we now call the cesarean section, at least from antiquity and possibly from prehistory. For most of human history, a C-section was only used when the birth had failed and the mother was close to death in an effort to save the child. Countless legends and records describe the procedure. The Chinese records of the Grand Historian records that a descendant of the mythical Yellow Emperor had 6 sons, all by cutting open the body, which might reflect the use of a cesarean section. Asclepius, a Greek god of medicine, was said to have been cut from his mother's abdomen. Around 272 BC, a story survives that the mother of an Indian emperor died after accidentally consuming poison, but that a teacher and advisor of the emperor cut the baby out, saving its life. Numerous other stories and legends from antiquity mention birth by cesarean section, including the Jewish Babylonian Talmud and the Irish Ulster cycle. Pliny the Elder, who died in 79 AD, suggested that Julius Caesar's cognomen, Caesar, may have come from an ancestor who was born by cesarean section. Caesar himself was likely not born by C-section despite the word of legend, as his mother survived well afterwards. Many other origins for his name were also offered, and it's ultimately unclear where the term actually originates. Though it was occasionally performed on living women, the C-section was a procedure of last resort. It's possible that Beatrice of Bourbon, Queen of Bohemia, is the first woman known to have survived a cesarean birth in 1337, but the evidence is unclear. A more certain account comes from 1580 of a Swiss woman surviving the operation to have further children. Up until the 19th century, however, death was a near certainty, and even in the 1860s, the mortality rate of C-sections performed in Great Britain and Ireland remained around 85%. Physicians looked for another option. In 1597, Severin Pinot, a French surgeon, observed the dissection of a woman hanged 10 days after giving birth and noticed that the pubic bones were clearly seen to be freely moving. In the human pelvis, the hip bones are connected at the front by a symphysis, a cartilaginous joint. The joint can be moved somewhat, and in childbirth it becomes more flexible. Cutting it entirely was seen as a way to allow birth without having to resort to the C-section. In fact, splitting of the cartilage at the joint can happen during birth even without surgical intervention. The suggestion wasn't acted upon for decades. According to an 1895 article in the British Medical Journal, in 1655, a doctor divided the joint with a knife to save a child whose mother had died during birth, and a similar procedure was performed in 1766. In 1768, French physician Jean Segaud called attention to the bad results of cesarean section and proposed to substitute it with the symphysiotomy in certain cases, in a communication to the French National Academy of Surgery. Segaud wanted protection in the case of a criminal proceeding against him using the procedure. The Academy refused to protect him, which also rejected the proposed operation. In 1777, Segaud finally performed the procedure on a 30-year-old woman by candlelight. The patient sat up in bed on the 41st day, and on the 46th she was able to walk a few steps. 9 weeks later, she appeared before the Faculty of Medicine for the Academy, and the success was considered so great that the doctor was given silver medals for the procedure, and Segaud's memoirs would be printed in Latin and French and sent to doctors and authorities around the country. While this is usually reported as the first time that the procedure was done, it seems to have been done at least 3 years earlier in Naples. But the procedure, though potentially successful, was not without risk. The second operation was done in 1778. The child died, but the mother survived. 5 more operations followed. According to the article in the British Medical Journal, the mothers survived the operations, but not the children. Another doctor also did several operations, in this case losing one mother, but saving all the children. Elsewhere, the surgery was less successful. France abandoned the procedure. It was never widely practiced in England or Germany. It became much more popular, however, in Belgium, Holland, and Italy. The 19th century saw leaps and bounds in the safety of medical procedures, especially with the introduction of antiseptics, the development of germ theory, and the use of cleanliness procedures that eliminated cross-contamination between patients. Antiseptic methods also increased the safety of cesarean sections, but in Italy especially, doctors became proficient at symphysiotomies. In 1881, it took the international stage by storm when an Italian doctor presented his results to the London International Medical Congress. He had operated 50 times on 48 women, 2 having undergone the procedure twice, and saved 40 women and 41 children. In 1891, the safer method also came to Paris and became much more widely used. The 1895 publication recorded that since 1892, the procedure has been practiced pretty extensively throughout Europe and America. One of the advances in the symphysiotomy procedure is one that sounds ridiculous at first mention: the invention of the chainsaw. The earliest symphysiotomies were done with knives, simply cutting at the connection between the pelvic bones. 2 separate Scottish doctors are credited with similar inventions around the same time. In 1785, John Aitken published the second edition of Principles of Midwifery, containing a medical description of the female reproductive system and dealing with delivery. He described the use of a flexible knife, likely consisting of a link of chain held between 2 wooden handles, like a wire saw. The cartilage, or symphysis, he describes, is next carefully divided so as not to wound the bladder or the urethra. He includes a list of objections to the procedure, which include the chance that the cartilages may happen to be ossified and that the neck of the bladder could be wounded. He argued that his flexible saw, which I have contrived to use when there is ossification, infallibly remixes this objection, and that the flexible saw was far more accurate than a knife, which risks damage to other parts of the body. Around the same time, James Jeffrey claimed to have conceived of nearly the same instrument, but that he wasn't able to produce the device until 1790. In 1806, Jeffrey published Causes of the Excision of Carious Joints, which included a 1782 paper and a translation of a French paper from 1806, as well as his own observations. The paper suggests the use of a chainsaw, as Jeffrey describes it, a saw with joints like the chain of a watch, for the excision of diseased joints. The blade he invented, which he says was first envisioned shortly after the 1782 paper, was lent out to surgeons in the 1790s, and Jeffrey explained his saw was better than a blade as it made smaller wounds and did less damage to nearby veins and muscles. The chainsaw in either form was more accurate, less painful, and quicker than use of a knife. These blades had chains, but were otherwise more similar to a wire saw, which could be wrapped around the pelvic bone. The doctor would then alternate pulling each handle and quickly cut through the symphysis. In the 1830s, a further invention was created by Dr. Bernhard Hein. Hein was a German physician and a specialist in bones and spent years searching for less invasive and damaging tools for surgery. In 1830, he presented his new tool, which he dubbed the osteotome. His invention specifically dealt with bones as opposed to childbirth, and he wrote about his experiments to find a solution. I looked with disgust, he wrote, at the laborious task of opening the spinal canal in corpses, and to facilitate this process I invented a disc saw, which, however, did not serve the purpose. After many fruitless attempts, I presented myself the somewhat paradoxical question: why aren't the bones treated with a knife like the soft parts? The osteotome was quite different from the Scottish doctor's inventions. Instead of having two handles, it had only one and had a sprocket wheel to turn the chain, which carried small teeth that sat at an angle. Although not electric, it is functionally very much like a modern chainsaw. The invention was highly prized and widely used. An 1836 dissertation said that as rich as surgery is in terms of new inventions, the osteotome invented by Dr. Hein in Würzburg stands alone, far outshining all others, an instrument that was once indispensable for every surgeon. Throughout the 19th century, the chainsaw was seen as a useful instrument for surgery, although it was widely replaced in the 20th century after the 1894 invention of the Geely twisted wire saw, which remains in use today. The latter part of the 19th century also saw the invention of chainsaws in their more modern form. In fact, prior to the 19th century, saws were rarely used for felling trees. There was a clear division of resources. Axes were used for felling and debranching, and saws were for cutting lengths. Versions of mechanical saws proposed in the early part of the 19th century were simply too heavy and unwieldy to be practical to use in the forest. In 1883, Frederick L. McGaw of Flatlands, New York, patented an endless chainsaw, which, like Hein's osteotome, had chain links adorned with saw teeth to produce boards. Samuel Benz of San Francisco added a guide frame in his patent in 1905, intending to use the machine to cut down giant redwoods. 1918 saw Canadian James Shan patenting the first portable chainsaw. He came up with the idea while he was building a fence on his land and found that the barbed wire pulled by his horses had cut clear through a 7-inch post. He built his first prototype using his son's bike chain, but his largest contribution was a one-lunger motor, which allowed the machine to be portable. He failed to sell the machine and let his rights lapse in 1930, which allowed further development by others. Joseph Buford Cox, an American, examined the larva of the timberman beetle, which used its jaw to cut side to side instead of straight ahead, which inspired him to invent the chipper-type chain, which he began producing in the 1940s. Most modern chainsaws use chains based on his innovation. Swiss inventor Andreas Stihl did even more, leading him to be hailed as the father of the chainsaw. In 1926, he patented the cut-off chainsaw for electric power, a huge machine that required two operators, but was the first electric chainsaw. In 1929, he built the tree-felling machine, a petrol-powered saw, 2 years after German Emil Lerp, founder of the company Dolmar, had built a similar one. In 1930, Stihl created the first chainsaw that could be operated by just one person. World War II cut off the supply of these German chainsaws, leading American companies to produce their own. Aluminum helped lighten the devices, and in various sizes, they have essentially replaced all man-powered saws in forestry. Chainsaws have made it into popular culture as well, with chainsaw art, a growing art form, and of course, they've been central to plots of numerous horror movies since the 1960s. Electric-powered saws remain in use in surgery, though these are precision instruments and don't utilize chains. And so, as surprising as it is, the history of the invention of the chainsaw really comes from two places. First, from medicine, and only later, the industrial versions that we use today for cutting wood. Symphysiotomies fell out of use in the 20th century as anesthesia in modern medicine made C-sections much easier and, importantly, survivable. Better tools and electric power generally made the use of chainsaws inadvisable. These days, a chainsaw would usually not be considered a precision instrument, nor would it be thought to do less trauma than surgical knives and saws. As I often say, sometimes truth is just stranger than fiction, and that is well demonstrated by the fact that the large, loud device that we use today primarily for cutting firewood found its original purpose to help deliver babies. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguyguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you have to do is subscribe.